On behalf of the Institute for Advanced Study, I'd like to welcome you to this Branigin lecture. This is an ongoing series of visits and presentations by scholars and public intellectuals from around the world, and it's made possible by a generous bequest from an alumni, Jean Porteous Branigin, for a lecture specifically on the Bloomington campus, and I'm pleased to acknowledge her gift. This is the second time I've had the privilege of meeting tonight's speaker. The first was perhaps 12 or so years ago when she visited Women's Studies and Latin American Studies to give a lecture on her work then in progress. That visit, as I now remember, served as my introduction to her border crossings and to Esperanza, whose stories told about and around her life I have now read in Translated Woman. And it is indeed appropriate that her visit and lecture allow us to mark Women's History Month, and particularly the celebration of the lives of women who have seldom made it into books. I've mentioned Esperanza, for she is the subject of Translated Woman. But that book or study has two subjects, and the other is the author, tonight's speaker, Ruth Behar. This dialogic reflexivity is undoubtedly the hallmark of Behar's work, developed somewhat differently in a series of autobiographical essays titled The Vulnerable Observer, Anthropology That Breaks Your Heart. Early in that work, she muses on the ethnographic enterprise in a particular way, and I quote, "As an anthropologist, you go elsewhere, but the voyage is never simply about making a trip to a Spanish village of thick-walled adobe houses in the Cantabrian Mountains, or a garden apartment in Detroit where the planes circle despondently overhead, or a port city of cracking pink columns and impossible hopes known as La Habana, where they tell me I was born. Loss, mourning, the longing for memory, the desire to enter into the world around you and having no idea how to do it, the fear of observing too coldly or too distractedly or too raggedly, the rage of cowardice, the insight that is always arriving late, a defiant hindsight, a sense of the utter uselessness of writing anything, and yet the burning desire to write something. These are the stopping places along the way. At the end of the voyage, if you are lucky, you catch a glimpse of a lighthouse, and you are grateful. Life, after all, is bountiful." This quotation hints, of course, at something else, that Ruth Behar is also a writer in the belles lettres sense. She is a poet, a short story writer, is also writing a novel and producing a documentary film, in all of which she interrogates identity and memory, the self and family, the very practice of ethnography. Educated at Wesleyan and Princeton, recipient of numerous awards, including a MacArthur Award and a Guggenheim Fellowship, she's currently Professor of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. It's my pleasure to welcome her again to Indiana.
Thank you. I'm very honored and humbled by that introduction, and very happy to be here again. Can you all hear me in the back? Is this going to be loud enough? Okay, great. I really want to thank Mary Ellen Brown for the invitation to be here, and also my friend Gracia Clark and John Aiken for facilitating my visit. For the last 10 years, I have been traveling back and forth to Cuba, the place of my birth and earliest childhood. I have gone so many times I have lost count, but I believe I've made 30 visits by now. Brief, intense, lightning flash trips of a few weeks' duration. When my family and I left the island in the early 60s, I was not yet 5 years old, too young to realize we were leaving forever. I have no memory of Cuba. I return in the guise of an anthropologist, seeking to understand issues of race, religion, diaspora, and women's bonds. But in reality, I'm seeking something much more elusive. I want to know where memory ends and history begins. And I want to know where history ends and imagination begins. I want to know, can I rely on the raft of my feminist historical imagination to take me home to the motherland I lost as a child? There is one person on the island of Cuba whom I have come to view as the key guide in my journey, and that is Caridad Martinez, known by everyone as Caro. An Afro-Cuban woman, Caro was my caretaker as a child. She came to the airport with us to say goodbye when my family and I left Cuba, and she insists on being with me now as well, every time I leave Cuba to return to my work and my other life in the US. Over the past decade, we have developed a relationship of trust and intimacy. Caro and her older sister, Tere, who was employed by my great-aunt and great-uncle to care for my cousins, knew my entire extended Jewish Cuban family. Over many days and nights spent together, they have told me vivid stories about my bloodkin, from my great-grandparents to my mother and father. Both viewed their caretaking as serious work which they performed diligently and thoughtfully to such an extent that they often felt they understood the needs of the children under their care better than the inexperienced mothers who employed them. Tere, in fact, gave up an offer of marriage to continue caring for my mother's cousin Henry as he lay dying of leukemia. She felt that no one would attend to the child as well as she could. After his death in 1954, she never married, and once my family had gone, she continued to visit his grave in the Jewish cemetery outside of Havana. My first effort to tell this story 10 years ago was a poem dedicated to Tere. In the absence of Jewish bloodkin on the island, it was Tere, an Afro-Cuban woman, who preserved Jewish memory by honoring the little Jewish bones of the boy that she had cared for. When I'm in Havana, I stay a few blocks from the house Caro and Tere share with Caro's children and grandchildren, and I'm expected for dinner every night. I'm Caro's anchor to the past before the revolution, and to her own younger self as an unmarried and childless domestic worker. I'm also her link to the goods and wealth I have access to as a Cubana of the diaspora. During the last 10 years of the economic crisis in Cuba, she has been able to count on me to bring vapor rub, clothes, and sneakers for her grandchildren and to help her financially. In turn, Caro is my anchor in Cuba and the keeper of my childhood left unfinished there. She is the reason I return. She embodies and preserves the story of my past life in Cuba, which I can't consciously remember. But she also knows of my literary aspirations and intellectual interests, and she clips and saves newspaper articles for me about writers and artists whom I know in Cuba. Indeed, she knows of my yearning to find a way to write our story. She has accompanied me during Santeria rituals performed to aid me in achieving clarity in my path. The two of us together are crafting the story of our shared present, in which we are forging a bond that cannot help but acknowledge the history and continuing fact of our race and class differences, while at the same time we move into the future in a way that defies the cliché that brought us together in the first place. There is no question we enact a sublime illusion, for even as we seek an emancipatory twist to this re-encounter of black nanny and white girl-woman, we recognize it is I who have the privilege to come and go, and it is Caro who waves goodbye at the airport. And yet, Caro and I share a story of loss. It is that loss and the different desires we bring to the loss which connect us so intensely. Both of us in quite different ways that embody our different race and class positions, lost a home in Cuba. Caro refuses to return there, but I have returned many times to the apartment my parents rented in Havana, the apartment I lived in as a small child, in which Caro lived with me, my parents, and later my younger brother. The family who lives there now, an Afro-Cuban family, conserves the furniture my parents left, the dining room table and chairs, the sofa, the coffee table, the bedroom set with its dresser. The woman of the family showing me around says, "We've taken good care of everything. Tell your parents everything is exactly as they left it." Our old apartment, this apartment redolent with object memories of our presence 40 years after our departure, was to have become Caro's home. Upon leaving, my parents turned the apartment over to Caro, along with all of the possessions they were forced to leave behind. Caro married 4 days before we left, asking my parents to be witnesses at her wedding, and she planned after we left to live as a wife in the apartment where she'd been the maid. I have turned to this journey of the feminist historical imagination because I want to answer the question, what did it feel like for Caro to shift from being the maid on the morning of May 4th, 1961, to being the lady of the house on the afternoon of May 4th, 1961? What did it feel like to know that the house she'd been cleaning for others was now her own house? I especially need to try to answer this question because the time Caro spent as lady of the house was short-lived, and it came to an end traumatically for her, so traumatically that she will not speak of it. What I know of this moment in her life has been pieced together from stories others have told me. 4 months after our departure, the building manager, a fervent revolutionary with whom she did not get along, reported Caro to the government, and she was ordered to leave the apartment. Caro refused to leave, claiming her right as a former maid to inherit the apartment of her employers. Police chopped the door down with an axe, and she was given minutes to pack her essential belongings and get out. Caro won't speak of this loss of the house that by right of her labor and the redistributive ethics of the revolution should have been hers. Her disillusionment runs deep, and it is only recently she has gone back with me to the street corner where she and I lived once. But she refuses to set foot in the building, and not for anything in the world will she go upstairs again to the top floor, to apartment number 18, which in the Jewish tradition is a lucky number. From that apartment she salvaged something that was not hers, but that she deemed worthy of saving. 2 nightgowns of nylon and lace, haunting items of intimate, erotic, and profound feminine longing. As transparent as mantles of nakedness, 2 honeymoon nightgowns that belonged to my mother and were made from the nylon and lace my grandparents sold in their small fabric shop in Old Havana. 3 years ago, Caro pulled them out of a double-wrapped plastic bag and said she had been meaning to give them to me for a long time. She said she had hoped to give them to my mother herself, but she no longer believed my mother would return to visit Cuba, or that she, Caro, now in her 70s, would ever have a chance to see my mother in New York. "Here, you take them," she said. "Tell your mother I saved them for her." As I take the nightgowns from Caro's hands, I feel I'm being given something precious and eerie from the past. A chill creeps up my spine. These are my mother's nightgowns, kept from the years when she was in her early 20s, kept from the first 5 years of her marriage, kept from the last 5 years she spent in Cuba, from 1956 to 1961, before we left the island. "Your mother was so thin then," Caro says to me. "Look at that cinturita, the little waist she had. She only weighed 99 pounds when she got married." When I tell my mother about the nightgown, she too feels a chill creep up her spine. She doesn't quite remember when she wore them. That was so long ago. And then I touch the lace, and I go back to a yet farther past. I see my grandfather, a Russian Jewish immigrant to Cuba, arriving in the 1920s and working on the building of the railroad, and gradually moving from being a peddler to owning the little lace shop on Calle Aguacate in Old Havana. I see the lace, and I see his strong hands measuring and cutting the lace. In case you can't imagine, these nightgowns, I actually brought one today, so to show you. Oh, perfect. Little installation art. So, why did Cado keep my mother's delicate lingerie during so many tumultuous years of revolution and change? Why, of all the things she could have salvaged from the apartment in the few moments she was given to gather her belongings, did she keep those nightgowns? What was the nature of the bond between Cado and my mother that compelled Cado to save such a gift of memory for my mother? Cado won't say, so she asks me to imagine instead. In introducing Persuasions and Performances, James Fernandez wrote, quote, that anthropology begins with revelatory incidents, those especially charged moments in human relationships which are pregnant with meaning. When Cado gave me those gowns, I knew my anthropology had begun. I knew I was entering into that realm which Fernandez has called the inchoate, a realm whose realness he had to defend on various occasions. Being, as he described himself, quote, at incipient moments of thought a visualizer rather than a verbalizer, he represented the inchoate as the dark at the bottom of the stairs. And he added, after its being that, whatever that is, it is all the other images and contexts that are swung into association with that central and organizing image to cast light upon it. He concluded, quote, that the images we generate to solve problems are always a function of our primordial experiences. For me, the inchoate are those honeymoon nightgowns that now hang from plump satin hangers on the door to the room where I write. Unlike the dark at the bottom of the stairs, they are palpable things and yet every bit as elusive. They are relics, ruins, fragments salvaged from that prehistory which is the pre-revolutionary Cuban past and my childhood. The nightgowns are silent. They must be made to speak, to tell their story. I think of these nightgowns as feminine archaeological evidence through which I want to imagine and conjure the abandoned homeland. They are also a gift that connects the past and the present in elusive ways, a gift that reflects the kinds of bridges that are possible between women even when separated by ethnicity, class, religion, time, distance. My mother, a white middle-class Jewish woman, left Cuba in a hurry. Her honeymoon nightgowns stayed behind, but another woman, a black Cuban working-class woman, salvaged them from the wreck of oblivion, saved them for her. Another woman who had no need to do so returned them to her. I possess them now, these nightgowns from Cuba. They are a form of currency for me as a feminist scholar who has chosen to occupy a borderland space between creative and critical forms of representation. The anthropologist Arjuna Padurai has written, quote, the world we live in today is characterized by a new role for the imagination and social life. The image, the imagined, the imaginary, these are all items which direct us to something critical and new in global cultural practices, the imagination as a social practice. With Cado's gift of the nightgowns, I came to realize that I needed to embark on a journey of the feminist historical imagination, bringing together the image, the imagined, and the imaginary to tell the story of my Jewish Cuban family as seen from Cado's perspective. The ultimate feminist anthropological act would be, I felt, to be able to see the women in my Jewish Cuban family not as they saw themselves, but as the subject of another woman's gaze. The ultimate act of feminist memory, I felt, would be for Cado to act as the witness to our abandoned Jewish existence in Cuba, the traces of our presence there marking her consciousness. The ultimate act of autobiography, I felt, required an act of fiction. As the critic John Akins has noted, autobiography in our time is increasingly understood as both an art of memory and an art of imagination. Indeed, memory and imagination become so intimately complementary in the autobiographical act that it is usually impossible for autobiographers and their readers to distinguish between them in practice. Part of what I need to try to imagine, since I was too young to remember, is the Jewish community of Cuba before the revolution. Cuba had 15,000 Jewish citizens before the revolution and now only has 1,000. Jews found a welcome and tolerant home in Cuba, and only because of this did not perish. But sadly, the terms of our survival depended on the ugly logic of race and racism. Fearing that the growth of the black population during the final years of slavery and the prominent role played by Afro-Cubans in the wars for independence would lead them to take over the island, the Cuban government encouraged massive immigration of European workers and their families, Jews included. Even Jews like my family, not welcome in the US in the early decades of the 20th century because of discriminatory immigration laws, were white enough to dilute the so-called black peril and forestall the possibility of Cuba becoming a black nation. And so there is terrible irony, but also poetic justice, in Caro telling the story of how her consciousness as an Afro-Cuban woman has been marked by Jewish memory. A Polish Jew founded the Communist Party in the 1920s, but following the revolution in 1959, the majority of Cuban Jews who had risen from peddlers to shopkeepers left the island. Their businesses were nationalized by the government, and even those who remained peddlers felt threatened by the centralization of power and the loss of economic freedom. Cuban Jews resettled in Miami and New York, keeping Spanish as their native tongue, maintaining their Jewish traditions, and bitterly bemoaning the loss of their beloved island where they had remade enchanted lives for themselves. The Jews who stayed in Cuba, in turn, integrated themselves into the revolutionary process and cast aside their Jewish identity. Only in the early 1990s did a religious revitalization take place, buttressed by the assistance of international Jewish agencies and the national moral crisis that accompanied Cuba's economic crisis after the collapse of the communist order, the Soviet communist order. And yet, even with the revitalization, there is a haunting sense of Jewish absence, made even more stark by the busloads of Jewish American tour groups coming to Cuba in search of the vanishing tribe of Castro's Jews, as Hadassah magazine has dubbed them. The fictional Caro, renamed Regla or Yeya, is the anthropologist, observing my Jewish Cuban family in the period before and just immediately after the revolution, and trying to understand the beliefs and practices of its different members through her vision of the world as an Afro-Cuban woman who comes of age in a household in the countryside where Santeria was practiced. Regla is the name of the town where the Virgin of Regla, or Yemaya, is housed, and in the Orisha pantheon she is a strong female deity associated with the ineffable power of the ocean. Although uncredentialed as an anthropologist, Regla, as domestic workers typically must be, is ever vigilant of the customs and habits of her employers. Regla is struck, for example, by the similarity between the Jewish practice of not consuming the blood of any animal that is slaughtered for human consumption because its blood is its life force, and the Santeria practice of giving the blood of animal sacrifices to the Orishas to maintain their vital energy. My efforts to engage imaginatively with this Afro-Cuban religion, forged in the fire of slavery and the hope of freedom, draw from my ethnographic fieldwork on Santeria practices both in Havana and in the town of Agramonte, where my mother's Jewish family settled, a region known as Little Africa because of the strong and vital presence of African cultural and religious roots left by the many slaves brought there to work the cane. And it's interesting because my mother's family settled there in the 30s, and they were the only Jewish family in this small town, a couple of hours away from Havana. Oh, this is acquiring a life of its own here. In my work, I want to acknowledge the presence of the African spirits around whom my Jewish Cuban family dwelled in unknowing and dangerous ignorance. I have been graced profoundly by being brought inside the remaining casas de fundamento in Agramonte, houses where descendants still conserve the sacred stones that once belonged to ancestors bound into slavery, stones on which have been poured the blood sacrifices of generations. My hosts in Agramonte invited me to lift the bell that lay on the ground near the bowls of the stones and ring it to honor the spirits and ask of them what I needed. I rang the bell and I gave thanks. In the opening scene of the book, Regla pulls out from under her cot, as soon as the Jewish Cuban family has gone, a Santeria ritual object, a tureen for the ocean deity of Olokun that she'd kept hidden, and proudly puts it in the living room. That is her first act of resistance as an Afro-Cuban woman who will no longer be anyone's maid. But when she is forced out of the apartment, she remembers to take the honeymoon nightgowns for the Jewish Cuban woman who once employed her. For even in the moment of her worst despair, she can feel compassion for what another woman, so unlike her, has lost. Every day I see those nightgowns as I write, and every day I gain strength from the determination with which Caro held on to those gowns as she descended the 4 flights of stairs from apartment number 18, seeing the dark at the bottom, and yet having faith that she'd salvaged from my mother something of transparent beauty, of innocence, from the wreck of oblivion and the home that neither of them would see again. In wanting to be an anthropologist who is consciously embarking upon the telling of a fiction, I know that if I place myself in the genealogy of Chicana Latina writers, invoking as godmothers such writers as Gloria Ansaldúa and Norma Cantú, I can look to them for inspiration in breaking down the wall between creative and critical writing. Norma Cantú calls her writing fictionalized autobioethnography, and she writes across the genres of folklore, memoir, and fiction, and across English and Spanish, vernacular, and poetic languages. Yet there's a risk in being a Latina genre outlaw. Our writing might be viewed as so unclassifiable that it will get lost in the cracks of all those knowledge practices and literary forms we are meshing together, rendering it too soft for the academy and too hard for our readers outside, most especially and painfully for members of our own Latino communities. In the realm of anthropology, we've just emerged from nearly 2 decades of discussion about the nature of the rhetoric, allegories, metaphors, and fictions that undergird anthropological accounts of other worlds. Ethnography, the genre that once could only accommodate writing about primitives, has become a much more democratic and profound genre. Not only is it interdisciplinary and intercultural, but it accommodates an incredibly wide range of commitments to the telling of stories. It continues to be a genre that chronicles vexing encounters across the borders of race, class, nation, and culture, and that demands an especially attentive listening, looking, feeling, and being there. But the journeys that are taken now in our post-colonial era are accountable to history, memory, the emotions, identity, passion, and the soul in ways they have never been before. A fiction like the one I'm creating may find a space on the shelf as experimental ethnography, but I would prefer to think of it as ethnography that had to become fiction or not be at all. Inevitably, even as I create this fiction, I stay grounded in the commitment of anthropology to tell a thick story of real presence. Most of all, I want the material on Santeria to be ethnographically accurate so the religion is presented in its fullness and not exoticized or demeaned. The imaginative web of fiction, I believe, needs to be spun from respectful ethnography and critical consciousness. My desire to write fiction is not without its didactic edge. I seek a way to position my creative writing in a way that will challenge many of the assumptions of both Cuban American and Jewish American fiction and permit a dialogue with African American fiction. I'm distressed by the self-orientalism, as I call it, that I often perceive in Cuban American fiction, which is largely the product of white writers, where members of my own immigrant community exoticize our stories and too frequently portray Santeria in ways that are facile, distorted, and uninformed. The representation of domestic workers in these texts is disturbing and appears in unselfconsciously sexist and racializing gazes. In one Cuban American text, the author relishes a memory of a maid from his parents' household climbing a tree to pick some mangos while he looks up her dress. To this day, he writes, quote, "I cannot bite into the pulp of this juicy fruit without thinking of Vaselia's undies." Yeah. In turn, I find that Jewish American fiction is relentlessly Jewish in perspective, characters, and setting, and lacks trust in the possibility that non-Jews might also care about Jewish memory and Jewish survival. I want to try to see Jewishness from an Afro-Cuban working woman's position, an outsider's position, because I want to envision a world in which Jews are not solely responsible for Jewish diasporic remembering, a world, too, in which African Americans of both our Americas are not solely responsible for African diasporic remembering. And yet I take a huge risk in trying to write in the voice of a working-class Afro-Cuban woman. As I write, I feel the heat of the imaginary accusations of appropriation, inauthenticity, ventriloquism that I expect will be directed at me if and when I do finish and publish my text. There is a burden of representation so heavy I have called this story an untellable story. I have steeped myself in the extensive literature on African American mammies and domestic workers, everything from Alice Childress's bitter memoir, like One of the Family, to the historical and sociological accounts that stress again and again that the most exploitative labor extracted from domestic workers has always been the emotional service they are expected to render as part of the personalized relationship they enter into with the women whose houses they must keep tidy and whose children they must keep happy. When I talk to my mother about the writing I'm doing from Cato's perspective, she says, "Look, Ruthie, don't believe me, but Cato wasn't someone you could tell what to do. Cato made all the household decisions. Cato cooked for us what she felt like eating. She cleaned when she thought it was necessary. She went home to Melena on weekends. I would send bags of groceries for her to take to her father. She shared a bedroom with you, and we all used the same bathroom. She never wore a uniform, nor did I ask her to wear one. She didn't call me Señora. She called me by my name. She called me Rebecca." Like the U.S. South, which until the 1950s was referred to as a white housewife's utopia because of the abundance of inexpensive black domestic servants, in Cuba before the revolution, the labor of rural black working women came cheaply. Here is the tragedy, the true sorrow, that my parents were not rich, comfortably upper-class Cubans, but a newly married couple in their early 20s who depended on the wages my working-class Sephardic father earned working for my mother's Ashkenazi uncle, and that even so they could afford Cato's labor, the labor of a black woman who had yearned to become a teacher. There was no back door, no back room, no separate bathroom for Cato, as there was in the better households. Our bourgeois identity was uncertain at best, even when Cato refused to share meals with us in the dining room, chose always to eat alone in the kitchen. Cato claims a connection to our family by always asking after everyone, my brother, my parents, my cousins, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles. Cato herself insists on the fact that she never viewed her relationship to my family as one of servitude. I fear sentimentality so much that I want Cato to admit that my family oppressed her. Wasn't it unjust, I say, that you were a black woman working in a white home? No, she says, I was a maid, but not because I was black, because there weren't other jobs. And I, not satisfied, say, but how many white women were there working in black homes? And she says, well, maybe in the home of an ambassador, someone rich like that. And I persist, but that wasn't usually the case. Really, wasn't it unjust? Wasn't it racist? Cato sighs and says, I earned my salary. I never felt inferior. I had my money and I bought what I wanted. The problem of domestic workers is not a racial problem, it's about class. Whoever didn't have back then and has now also has a servant, and it's the same thing. And she adds, you know, there's still maids today in Cuba. Fidel didn't put an end to that. Cato is telling me, lest I forget, not to tread on her sense of agency, her dignity. She worked in my parents' home, she earned a salary, she did her job well on her own terms. Yet knowing Cato as I do now in the aftermath of revolution, I recognize keenly that like countless black women of her generation, she was underemployed, employed below the level of her strong intelligence and best hopes. What if Cato had refused to see me the first time I went back to Cuba in 1979? What if, as I feared at the time, she'd closed the door in my face and said the revolution made it impossible for her to have anything to do with me? Instead, she opened the door, and not without risk. As I learned many years later, her CDR, or Neighborhood Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, cast a suspicious eye on her dealings with me, and Cato entered into some hefty arguments defending her right to see me. The fact is that Cato opened her door to me and continues to keep it open. I have walked through that door and found the lost time in both our lives. I'm going to switch registers now, so just get some water. The section from the emerging fiction that I want to share with you this evening concerns Cato's sister Tere, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, specifically that moment in her life when she made what was for her a moral decision to remain at the side of my mother's cousin Henry, even though it cost her the loss of her fiancé. And after our family left Cuba, as I noted earlier as well, Tere never stopped visiting Henry's grave in the Jewish cemetery in Guanabacoa. In my work in progress, I tell the story in more detail, mixing memories shared with me by Tere and Cato, as well as my mother and grandmother, with imagined possible realities. So now I'm going to read you an excerpt from this writing, as narrated by the character of Regla Caro. It was the summer of 1954. The letters from Europe with news of death had long since been tied with bits and pieces of satin ribbon and put away in perfumed drawers where they could vanish softly. There was nothing more for the Levy family to fear. Those they had lost in the war were lost forever, and they who had gotten on boats to Cuba and created families on this island had grown strong and prospered. They had prospered enough to have black women like myself and my sister Tere work in their households. Tragedy overtook them, and it came in a form unforeseen and unforeseeable and unalterable. If Elegua closes a door, no amount of cigar smoke, candies, and aguardiente can open it again. And so it was that in the summer of 1954, the Levy family learned that the death of IBL was imminent, and that all the medicine, money, and love in the world could not save him. For months, Ariel had complained of pains when walking or standing too long. Nathan and Rita had taken him to the best doctors in La Habana, who knew about every possible illness of the legs and feet, but they'd not found anything wrong with him. Then he'd started to grow unusually tired, and he started saying he didn't want to go to school anymore. Rita grew impatient with her son and told Tere one night that she wondered if he was pretending to be ill to get attention. But Tere, who knew the boy since birth, said that Ariel was not that kind of child, and that he was lately so drowsy he was falling asleep while eating his meals. Finally, Nathan and Rita got on a plane with Arielito and went to an important hospital in Minnesota, where they say the cold never lets up, not even in the summer. And there discovered the ugly truth. The child was suffering from leukemia, an illness for which there was no cure. Rita told Naomi that on the plane ride home she prayed for a crash so as not to have to return to Cuba to face the extinction of her son from this earth. He was only 11, the boy, and the big doctors in Minnesota said he would be gone before his 12th birthday. It was also in the summer of 1954, and this is why I remember the date clearly, that my sister Tere received a proposal of marriage. Amado had been courting her for years. He was a pretty-faced man with light brown skin and worked as a chauffeur for the ambassador of Mexico, who lived down the street from Nathan and Rita in Miramar. He wanted Tere to marry him and leave her job as a maid so she could attend to him and the needs of the children they would surely have in good time. He said the ambassador of Mexico held him in high regard and promised to pay for the wedding party, including a gown for Tere, and give him a generous wedding gift. He told Tere he adored her, but he didn't want to wait for her to make up her mind. If she loved him as he loved her, there was nothing to think about, no reason for doubts or delays. Tere was 28 and voluptuous, with good hips for dancing the rumba and cradling babies. She had always said that if she reached the age of 30 without getting married, then she'd never marry afterwards. My sister Tere is like that. She utters pronouncements and then lives by them. But how she suffered during the summer of 1954, of course I can't forget that date. Arielito was dying and the destiny of my sister Tere was being determined by the ancestors, the orishas, and the mule-headedness of her own will. She wanted to marry Amado because she did love him, but she had known Arielito since birth, and the thought of abandoning him to an indifferent caretaker just when he needed her most caused her tremendous pain. We chose a Sunday not long after Tere had received the marriage proposal and Ariel's illness had been diagnosed, to seek advice from our father and his padrino, godfather, in Agramonte. We went prepared with candies for elegua, white flowers for obatala, sugary rum cakes for ochun, and red candles for chango. In Agramonte, the first person we encountered was Anselmo, returning from his fields with an enormous cluster of green bananas. We bought the entire cluster from him to give as an offering to Chango, who is the owner of the banana, the fruit that sustains the poorest of the poor and keeps them from starving to death. Our father was at the kitchen table sorting through a mound of rice. I felt strange seeing him engaged in this woman's work, but with my mother long gone and only my brothers left in Agramonte, there wasn't a woman in my father's house to do the woman's work. Self-reproach stabbed at my soul. I, as the youngest daughter, my mother's ninth and the one who sucked at her breast the longest, had not kept my obligation to stay with my father and care for him. 10 years had passed since I'd left for La Habana, and I knew that I would not return to Agramonte again to live. All the country people I met in La Habana, and what maid, gardener, cook, or chauffeur in that sea-ravished city wasn't from the countryside, said they would never return home to their towns and villages. They'd been seduced by the charms of La Habana, and they would stay forever, even if they had to beg at the door of the cathedral. Tere and I only return to Agramonte now 3 times a year, for New Year's Day in January, for the anniversary of our mother's death in April, and for our father's Fiesta de Santo for Chango on the 4th of December. When we could, we also liked to return to Agramonte a second time in December to be there on the 16th and 17th of the month for the town celebration of San Lázaro, the powerful Babaluaye of our African ancestors who protects those who are ill and lame. That second visit in December depended on the phases of the moon in the Jewish calendar and when the Hanukkah holiday fell and whether my sister Tere and I were needed by the Levy family to peel and shred potatoes for the special pancakes they ate with sugar on that holiday. But this visit in the middle of July was totally unexpected. "Papi, here, let me clean the rice," I said, dropping my packages on the table and pulling up a seat next to my father. "Yayita, tranquila, I'm doing fine," he replied in his good-natured way. "You and Tere go greet the Santos, and then we can talk." I followed Tere into the room of the Santos, carrying the cluster of green bananas for Chango, which I placed at the foot of my father's bata drums. The air in that room was like no other. It smelled of flowers and fruits left for the santos, and candle wax and tobacco and honey, and the memory of blood and the breath of the dead and the living. I always felt an immediate sense of peace and protection upon entering that room. Tere opened the cabinet below the Christian santos and exposed the enamel basins filled with the sacred stones of the fundamentos, which our ancestors had brought with them from Africa. She picked up one bell at a time to call each of the santos, and when she was done, I did the same. I can imagine what Tere must have asked of the santos, but I made sure to ask on her behalf as well, to pray for an easy and clear resolution to the indecision that was tormenting her about whether to marry the man she loved and would surely lose if she refused, or continue caring for the sick boy who loved her and would soon be lost to the world. My father's padrino, Victor Elizondo, or Chacho, as everyone had called him since the days of his youth, was the oldest babalao in Agramonte. He had very dark black skin that gleamed with the memory of Africa. People said he was a child when slavery was abolished in Cuba. He could remember the day they heard the news in Agramonte and how the elders, in gratitude, sacrificed doves, chickens, and goats, and the drums did not stop sounding for an entire week. And there was an abundance of food, and not a soul went hungry, and all of the orishas descended, and people ate and sang and danced until they collapsed from the exhaustion of being free. He said that a toque like that would never be seen again, and should never be seen again, even if it was a toque of extravagant beauty and passion, because slavery was the vilest thing that had ever been created by human beings. Expressing gratitude for its end only once until the end of time was enough. Chacho was nearly blind from cataracts. On the day he was received as a babalao, it was revealed that he would eventually go blind, and that he was not to try to prevent it, either by herbal remedies or the surgery of doctors, because if he did, a yet worse fate would befall him. As is true of blind people, he had a strong sense of smell and the delicate hearing of a musician. We'd barely approached his house or said a word, and he was already greeting us by our names. He was sitting very still in a rocking chair in the small porch at the entrance to his house, his hands folded on his lap. Teresita and Yayita, what brings you to me on this hot afternoon when there isn't a soul out in the street? It turned out not to be necessary. As we stood on either side of him, he passed the palm of his hand gently over Tere's brow and cheeks, and said he could tell she had been weeping, and that something was troubling her. He shook his head and rose from his rocking chair and asked us to please follow him inside. In a room next to the kitchen, he kept his santos and a large altar draped in purple for San Lázaro, or Babaluaye, who was his guardian saint, the saint he'd received and been crowned with when he took the path of the orishas. There he offered consultations to all those who felt they needed to ask the orishas for guidance and how to move forward in their lives. He sat down at his consulting table and told us to bring over the 2 chairs that were by the wall. From his pocket he pulled out the pouch in which he kept the ekele. He laid it on the table and felt the flat beads connected to each other by a thin silver chain to be sure they were positioned correctly. Then he gave Tere a seashell and a small smooth rock and told her to jiggle them and put each one in a different hand, and not to show him what was in either hand until he told her to. Over and over he picked up the ekele and let it fall on the table, and with every throw he'd ask Tere, I said jiggle or juggle? What's the correct word in English? Jiggle or juggle? Doesn't matter? It depends. Okay, so sometimes I'm still like struggling with English. Okay, to jiggle the shell and the stone and see in which hand each ended up. Finally he stopped and said he saw the pattern. He would tell her what it was, unless she first had any questions to ask of the oracle. Tere turned and looked at me, and I told her that I could not speak for her, not now, that she should ask if she wanted to know. Chacho, there's a man who wants to marry me, she began, but she didn't have to finish her sentence. Yes, said Chacho, and you should marry him. The orishas say you are at a crossroads, and that you must choose the path of love. Ochun herself speaks here in the ekele, and says that you will have her protection if you give yourself to the path of love, that you have nothing to fear because everything will go well for you. The orishas say you will have a happy marriage if you marry now, and children who will care for you in your old age. The sign that you got is an unusual one, and asks that you not neglect the demands of your heart, because if you do, you will suffer greatly later in life from pains in your heart so severe they will take your breath away. Your sign also says that you are to stay away from hospitals and cemeteries, to be careful not to have too much contact with those who are sick and dying, and to keep your distance from the dead. If ever you must go to a funeral, do not stay long, because the soul of a dead person will stick to you like glue. So, Teresita, now you know what the Orishas have to say. Listen to them, and especially to Ochun, and you will keep sadness and suffering from entering your life. I suggest you light a candle for Ochun tonight at your father's house and pray to her with devotion. Wear something yellow, even just a kerchief, to show her that you need her blessing on the path of love. But Chacho, the boy I'm taking care of in La Habana, is dying. How can I leave him? Tere was crying again. The boy certainly must have great affection for you, Teresita, because you have known him since birth and have attended to him with intelligence and devotion. But he has his mother and father, doesn't he? Teresita, don't disobey Ochun. She's very impulsive, very moody, and she's capable of withdrawing all of her protection in a second if you refuse it when she offers it to you. We left Chacho's house with heavy feet. Night had fallen and the heat was a little less thick. We had turned onto our street and could hear the call of the drums. The drums were sounding for Chango, and the hands coaxing the music from the animal skins and the carved wood were unmistakably those of my father. Tere trembled as we approached the house. She did not like bembes as I did, and had always kept her distance when the drumming and dancing and trancing got too animated. But no sooner had we entered the courtyard, where several neighbors had already assembled, than Tere began to dance, at first slowly and deliberately, and then faster, abandoning herself to the rhythm of the drums, which were now being played not only by our father, but by two other men who joined him to complete the trio of the Bata drummers. Tere was a good dancer, and in La Habana she often went with Amado to the dance halls that existed for mulattoes in those days. But the kind of rumba she was letting go that night didn't resemble in the least the controlled and numbered steps she took in the dance halls. She shook her shoulders and exaggerated the movement of her hips. Her hair, which that same morning before leaving La Habana she had straightened and neatly shaped into soft curls that lightly touched the nape of her neck, was now loose and wild and frizzy from the burning fire that was emanating from her own body. I had never seen her dance that way before and would never see her dance that way again. It was a dance of such longing and such desperation that it made you want to cry to watch her. At the same time, she looked beautiful, radiant, sensual, womanly. The drums were sounding for Chango that night, but my sister Tere had been possessed by Ochun, the least governable and most stunning of Chango's wives, and the only woman Orisha of our whole pantheon that could put no limits on her need to love. One of our neighbors, I don't remember if it was Mercedita, managed to tie a yellow kerchief around Tere's neck as she danced. She danced for a long time, and when she was done, the rumba ended, and everyone went home. Tere didn't light a candle that night for Ochun. My father and I helped her to bed, and the next morning she took the yellow kerchief off, folded it carefully, and put it in the handbag that Nathan Levy had given her for Christmas the year before. It wasn't until we stepped off the bus in La Habana that she told me that she'd made up her mind. She would not marry Amado. She would stay with Arielito for as long as it took him to die. It was another 3 months before Ariel died, and in that time, Amado went from being distressed that he'd lost Tere to finding another woman who did not hesitate for a second when he asked her to marry him. Si te vas, te juro que busco a otra si te vas. As that son Montuno goes, if you leave, I promise I'll find someone else. Tere stuck by her decision. She never wavered again. By the time Ariel was buried in the Jewish cemetery in Guanabacoa, she knew she would never marry, never live with a man, never bear children. Ariel went to his grave, and Tere held on to her virginity like a precious jewel. For women of our color and our class, that was an unusual jewel to own. As a perpetual virgin, Tere acquired the power to see through lies, to know the secrets that others work so diligently to hide. But this only became apparent to me in the future, long after the coming of the revolution, and many years after the Levy family had left Cuba. Ariel was buried in his Jewish grave. He became for all eternity part of the soil of Cuba. He would be of the island, always of the island. He would never leave us. He would never know exile. Death had made him ours, ours for as long as Olokun, in the ocean depths, remained merciful and let our island keep floating above the water. Okay, after reading these excerpts to you, I worry. I've dared tonight to use an academic space to share some fictional writing that is still very much in progress. Was I brave or naive? The truth is, I myself do not know if this mix of self-reflexivity and fictional storytelling works as an academic lecture. But we don't learn what's possible until we attempt something. To have presented anything else would have been less than honest on my part, for this is the work I'm doing now. This is the work that preoccupies me now as a feminist ethnographer. I also don't think I'm alone in the enterprise I'm pursuing. I'm grateful that Virginia Dominguez, a Cuban-American anthropologist well respected for her writings on race and identity, has recently said that what we must now pursue in anthropology is a politics of love and rescue. Love for those whom we write about and a commitment to rescue, through various forms of feminist historical imagining, the common languages that differently situated women have created, often with pain, anger, and sorrow, but also with a sustaining hope. As I'm writing, I see the nightgowns from Cuba that Caro saved for my mother for 40 years and one day gave to me. What faith, what trust these nightgowns embody in the possibility of re-encounters between women across the separations of revolution, exile, and history. It is Caro, I realize, who first enacted a politics of love and rescue long before I knew I would tell this story. If she continues to permit me to love her, I will keep writing, respectfully trying to know her voice, using my privilege to imagine into existence a space of power for her in a history that would erase her presence and agency. Gayatri Spivak has said, quote, "What I cannot imagine stands guard over everything that I must, can, do, think, live." I want to believe that I'm engaging in a necessary, essential, and urgent imagining, an imagining that will remove the last of the guards from the gate, an imagining that will allow both Caro and me a lost home in the floating island of memory, where nightgowns from the past refuse to forget the honeymoon they once witnessed. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions, comments.